Hey everyone, this is Nick, and since I already made a tier list video about desktop environments, I guess it's only fair I now make one about distros. And like the previous one, it's not just going to be my face over tier maker, because that's super boring. And of course, I can only rate distros that I actually tried myself. So if your favorite one isn't on the list, leave me a comment down below, I'll give it a shot, maybe make a dedicated video, and I'll make sure at least to try it out for the next tier list video. And in the meantime, you can try out our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Safing's Portmaster. Portmaster is an all-in-one tool to easily take your privacy to the next level, and it's a tool I use myself on all of my Linux devices. Portmaster lets you automatically block all trackers and malware in every application you run on your computer. Not just your web browser, but everything you run. It's easy to use with defaults already in place that let you just set it and forget it. But if you like to configure every rule and every app, you also can. Portmaster is completely free and open source, and also free of charge, as it's funded by users that subscribe to the SPN, a super-powered VPN that gives you multiple identities for every connection of every application. So, if you want to easily improve the privacy of your system, whatever the Linux distro you use, or even on Windows, click the link in the description below and download the Portmaster for free. Okay, so let's begin with the first distro I ever used. Ubuntu. I've had a love-hate relationship with Ubuntu over the years. When I started with Linux, it was basically the best, the one that lifted everyone else by trying to make Linux in general more user-friendly and more accessible graphically. That was in 2006. As time went on, they slowly lost focus on the desktop, started resting on their laurels before slowly climbing out of the hole. But nowadays, I would just put Ubuntu in the decent category. It does follow the latest GNOME release cycle, they do have their own spin on that desktop, and they've regained some amount of stability that they had lost for a while. But they're not the best for beginners anymore, and they do force snaps on users, which I'm not a fan of, as it's undeniably not as good as other formats on the desktop. But it's not a bad distro. So yeah, decent. It's not the devil, but it's also not what I would recommend to new Linux users anymore. Now let's move on to Linux Mint, the no longer barf green distribution. Mint is a distro I used to not enjoy particularly, but nowadays I feel it's really one of the best options for most people. It now looks pretty good with its new default theme, and it's one of the most complete experiences out of the box. They have graphical utilities for everything, and their desktop, Cinnamon, is very customizable, but it remains simple to use. It's basically what I call the KDE of GTK. You've got tons of options, but everything is still super legible and simple to use in true GTK fashion. The distro is very stable, very well maintained, it walks back on the more controversial choices that Ubuntu makes, and it has a clear focus on user experience and ease of use. So I'm going to put it in great. It's a distro I could see myself using on a daily basis, with the only caveat being its pretty old Ubuntu LTS base, which means hardware support isn't always the best if you have the latest and greatest components in your PC. Still, Mint is a great choice for beginners and for advanced users alike, which is super rare in the Linux world, and it deserves to be mentioned. And now let's move on to the distro that started this channel, elementaryOS, and this is a hard one to place. On the one hand, it's a very polished experience, and I love what they're doing. They basically started this idea that each desktop environment should have their own ecosystem of apps that follows precise HIGs. They're still the only distro for now that offers payment to developers in their app store. They were the first to implement smooth one-to-one touchpad gestures, and on X11 no less. And they have a very considerate approach to how they develop features. And some people might think that this is a negative, as in you can't customize it, but that's sort of the point of the distro. It's a take it or leave it experience, And I like that approach. It doesn't try to serve everyone, it just offers something that they thought about. If it's not for you, that's okay. But on the other hand, if we look at where it is today, it is lagging behind GNOME in terms of polish and features and app ecosystem. And Elementary still makes decisions that cannot be described as anything other than boneheaded, like forcing users to completely reinstall with each new version, something that has been solved on Linux since 2005. Or they only enable their elementary apps in their store after install. And sure, it has Flatpak support and you can add FlatHub easily, but this means that after an install, you cannot install an Office suite or a web browser, which, come on, that's just not a good experience. So, as it stands today, elementaryOS is only going to be decent for me. I think they're biting off a bit more than they can chew. They're trying to make the apps and a desktop and a distro. And with elementaryOS 7, they released something cool, but that's not necessarily up to today's Linux standards. Okay, now let's talk about Arch Arch Linux, sorry. Arch is a distro I've used for a while and that I regularly go back to on and off, but never on a production device. It's a wonderful learning experience that teaches you how a Linux operating system is built, by letting you pick and layer every component you prefer on top of each other. And it lets you be really deliberate in the choices you make. It's also pretty much always up to date, plus you get access to the AUR to get virtually anything you want. But this is a double-edged sword. Arch doesn't hold your hand. It will let you destroy your system if you don't read update notes, or if you're not careful, or if you abuse the AUR. It is also simply not as stable as point releases like Ubuntu or Fedora. It gives you everything as it's released with minimal testing. And almost every problem with Arch is user error, not necessarily the fault of the distro. But it also means that there are a lot of potential errors. And there's the usual joke about installing it, but honestly, now you have pretty much guided installers that you can download and install, and even following the wiki isn't that hard. It's not my definition of a good time when I want to have a computer up and running. I would much rather have a graphical installer with 5 clicks to make, but it's not that tricky. So, Arch is going in good. But only if you know what you're doing and if you know how to fix a mistake. If you're a Linux beginner or someone who just wants to use their computer in a set it and forget it way, it's going in the no way category. Do not start your Linux journey with Arch Linux unless you have a lot of time to waste, you're ready to learn, and you have tons of hours to spend to read wikis and ask questions. It is not meant for beginners. Another distro I used for a while is Solus, and I liked it for the budgie desktop, which at the time felt like what I wanted from GNOME, and for its approach of building a Linux distro from scratch, without using Ubuntu as a base, for example. It also has a pretty good package manager, and its own set of repos. But Solus is going in no way, because it pretty much feels like a dying distro these days. The website was down for about 3 months, there hasn't been an up-to-date ISO released since mid-2021, the latest status update from the team dates back to the end of February, and packages don't seem very up-to-date either nowadays. Budgie, the desktop they use, even basically said they don't want people to experience Budgie through Solus anymore. And that desktop itself hasn't moved a lot in recent years, seeing minor updates as it's preparing a transition away from GTK and GNOME technologies. So yeah, no way I would ever use this thing in its current status. They need to prove that they're able to maintain a Linux distro, which for now they're proving they can't. So unless something happens, it's just not recommended at all. And on to Fedora, the distro I use everywhere these days, and yet I'm still only going to place it in good, not great. Because while I feel this is the distro that is pushing the Linux desktop forwards these days, by adopting the most modern technologies quickly, helping them get tested, contributing to them, I also feel they missed the mark in some ways. And I won't bore you with the installer again, it's horrible, it has the worst UX of any installer I ever used. They're working on another one, it's just bad, let's move on. Fedora also requires you to add a repo to install the NVIDIA drivers, which is annoying and makes for a less seamless experience. And until now, they also half-embraced Flatpak by not giving users an easy way to have FlatHub right at install, although that's going to be fixed in Fedora 38. Apart from that, it's smooth, it ships vanilla desktop environments so you can customize them as much or as little as you want, it's super stable, it's modern, it's good. Once the new installer is there and FlatHub can be enabled by default in just one click, and maybe once they add NVIDIA drivers readily available at install right on the ISO, then sure, it will move in the great category. But for now, it's good, really good. Okay, let's talk Deepin. It's a basic desktop environment, but it's also a distro. And it's a distro I'm putting in no way. The desktop environment looks beautiful, but the default apps are way too basic and can't handle half of the tasks I need from them. Installing anything else results in that nice unified look being completely broken, and as such, it's just not a good experience. And it also uses a very old Debian base, which for their "it's a desktop for everyone" purpose is just not good. And their performance is also hit or miss. And then there's the usual "is it spyware" thing, because it's from China and there's always some amount of Chinese paranoia somewhere, and it's hard to get cold hard proof on what it collects or not. It's open source, but the amount of code and the very little interest there is in Western countries means that it really hasn't been checked all that much. Now what's for certain is that it does collect some telemetry using a Chinese tool comparable to Google Analytics. So yeah, it lacks in features, the performance isn't that great, it uses a very old base, and there are some potential privacy concerns. It's going in the no way category. If you want to use the Deepin desktop, use Ubuntu DDE, it's much better. Now let's talk about Manjaro, and this one is going into no thanks. It's a distro I used a lot on my desktop, but I just cannot recommend it anymore. The distro itself isn't necessarily bad, but the way it's being run absolutely is. The team has a horrible track record of not renewing their security certificates for their websites, and instead of fixing the issue, they'll tell users to roll back their computer's clock so the certificate appears valid. They had issues with their treasurer leaving after some people misused company funds. They made deals with proprietary office suites replacing open source ones before backing down when the community was understandably pissed. They packaged beta or alpha versions of apps without asking the developers and passing that as a stable update. It's just super weird, kinda shady, not respectful, and I just don't think it sends a good message. And if you start mixing and matching Manjaro packages and stuff from the AUR, you can very quickly make that distro completely broken, as AUR packages might depend on newer versions of libraries that Arch ships, but that Manjaro doesn't yet. It's just not a very good platform. It's not very stable, it's not very performant, it's not bleeding edge either, and the way the company is run is so-so. So yeah, no thanks. Now, good old Debian, the granddaddy of Linux distros. And here I will refer to the stable version. I never ran testing or unstable personally. I like their new stance of offering proprietary drivers and firmware on the ISO, because you won't have them installed by default, but it makes the experience better for people who need them. It's rock solid, it's tested to perfection, and the repos are huge and well maintained. I hesitated a lot, but I'm gonna put it in the good category, although this is a distro I would never run on a desktop or laptop, exclusively on a server. Because Debian Stable is extremely old. It has very outdated versions of desktop environments and applications. And sure, the latter can be fixed using Flatpak or something equivalent, but the desktops? The current stable version is at GNOME 3.38 or KDE 5.20. There are full 3 GNOME versions behind and 7 KDE releases. And so I decided to put it in good still because that's the purpose of the distro. It's being super stable, super well tested, at the expense of having recent releases of anything basically. So I would personally never use it, but for people who need that, it's a very good distribution. Now let's move on to PopOS. It's a distro I really loved, and I even moved all my computers to it for a while. Its spin on GNOME is great. They add a lot of very useful features like auto-tiling and some customization on top. They include extra software on top of Ubuntu repos, they support FlatHub, and they actually have a stake in making sure the OS works really well, because, well, they sell computers with it pre-installed. Yeah, that kind of stuff will make you care a little bit, I guess. But for now, I will only put PopOS in the decent category, because it's in sort of a limbo while they develop their new Cosmic desktop shell. It looks very interesting, but in the meantime, PopOS hasn't seen a new release in almost a year. It uses an older version of GNOME, and its own additions to GNOME were not updated either. There is also no word on if we will see a PopOS release to follow Ubuntu 23.04 or what it will bring. And yes, I'm sure that once they release their new and updated Cosmic desktop and they start updating the base and the apps again, I'll be able to put them in good or great. But for now it's only decent because it's too old for a mainline desktop distro, it missed out on a lot, and you just don't know where it's going for now. Now let's continue with Gentoo, and look, this one just isn't for me. I tried it, I understand why it exists, but I also don't really feel the need to have almost everything I install be compiled for my hardware specifically. I don't need this level of control over what I install, and performance-wise I would argue that on a recent computer, you're never going to notice the difference. But that doesn't mean Gentoo is bad. It's solid, and once the long install process is finished, it runs like any other rolling distro. And the heavier packages are provided as binary, so you won't waste 20 hours compiling Chromium or LibreOffice. And that level of control over how you install things and what exactly you want to install is what some people look for. So Gentoo is going in the good category. It's not for me, but I'm not going to criticize it just because I'm not the target audience. Now let's move on to ZorinOS. It looks icy cold and cool, it has tons of layouts you can use to make it look and behave more like a desktop you're already used to. It includes a bunch of tools like a rebranded KDE Connect or Wine out of the box, and some people might call that bloat, but honestly, if you use that word, you're probably an Arch user and you had zero interest in an Ubuntu-based distro anyways. Now ZorinOS will go into the no thanks category, because it also suffers from the not updated often enough problem. They tend to release new major versions every 2 years only, which is not frequent enough for a desktop distro, at least in my opinion. You're stuck on super old GNOME with worse performance, no good Wayland support, older drivers. I just can't recommend it. Linux Mint uses an older base as well, but they provide regular updates to their desktop and apps. ZorinOS doesn't. If they had a semi-rolling release policy for the desktop and applications, then sure. But for now, if you install ZorinOS 16 today, it feels like going back in time. You're missing a lot, and there are better choices for your desktop. Now, KDE Neon, that's a good one. It also uses an older Ubuntu LTS base, which can be a problem, but it has all the latest software from KDE, from the desktop to the apps. And that's a very good mix, so it's going in good. Basically, it gets great stability, plus an evolving desktop, which is what I want from a desktop distro, even though they say themselves they are not a distro, but they clearly are. There's nothing much more to say here, it's a great choice for KDE lovers. Unless you really want snaps or you absolutely need a more up-to-date base than an LTS, I would never recommend Ubuntu to you over KDE Neon. It's just a better choice. And of course I plan to test a lot more distros this year, including OpenSUSE, which I haven't looked at in years, or NixOS, some immutable distros, and more. So if your favorite distro was not in that tier list, don't panic, tell me about it in the comments below, I'll take a look at it, if it's interesting enough, I'll make a dedicated video on it, and who knows, if I make another of these tier list videos, it might be included in it as well. Just like I included this segue to our sponsor. If you need a new computer and you plan to run Linux on it, stop buying Windows laptops or desktops and trying to retrofit Linux on top of it. For the best experience, click the link in the description below and buy a device from Tuxedo. They make computers, laptops, desktops, NUCs, gaming devices, whatever you want, that run Linux out of the box. The hardware is picked specifically for Linux. They are super customizable, the range will cover every price point and every need, and all laptops can be opened, repaired, customized, upgraded. You can replace the battery, the RAM, the SSD, and sometimes even the wireless card. So if you plan to run Linux and you need a new computer, buy something from Tuxedo, from the link in the description. It's just much better. So, thanks everyone for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't hesitate to like, to subscribe, to turn on notifications, to write a comment. And if you didn't like the video, there's always that little thumbs down button, but do tell me why in the comments as well. It's more polite. And if you really love the channel and you want to help support it, there are plenty of links down there for my social networks, LibraPay, PayPal, Patreon, YouTube thanks, YouTube memberships, whatever, you know what to do. So, thanks everyone for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!